Let's talk about Deerclops. Deerclops comes from the crossover with Don't Starve together, with their mechanics drawing directly from Don't Starve. As a result of this, it's one of the most unique bosses in all of Terraria with a collection of weird mechanics. It doesn't despawn when nearby players are dead, much like how they'll stick around in Don't Starve until the end of winter. They're completely immune to damage if the player gets a certain distance away. They'll launch a high damage and difficult to avoid snowball attack at a player that isn't up close, and then unleash a burst of shadow hands if you're above them. The legs don't have a hitbox, but the body does. Deerclops is also very clearly designed to be fought in the kiting fashion of Don't Starve. Unlike Terraria, Don't Starve doesn't really have ranged weapons. To fight enemies, you need to watch their attack animations and see when they're in a recovery period, then run towards them, hit them, and run back out before they attack again. Knowing that, Terraria's Deerclops starts to look pretty different. All of these weird mechanics fit together snugly to encourage one way of fighting, counting the attacks, running between the legs, and dodging them up close. It becomes invulnerable when you're at a distance to prevent the player from shooting it from a distance, since it won't despawn when you get far away and it doesn't have long-range attacks. Deerclops punishes being above it or far away with a burst of shadow hands and the snowballs because the fight wants you to be at the feet. The normal attacks can't reach those spots. In Terraria, Deerclops has a 3-hit combo. It starts with an audio and visual cue before hitting the side that you were on with an ice spike. You need to dodge it, and the easiest way to do that is to run through the legs to the other side. Then it'll follow up with a second hit, which is the same attack, and you'll go back to the other side. The final part of the combo hits both sides, but doesn't go very far, so you need to get out of range or just jump over it. Doing it in this way, which is very similar to the kiting of Don't Starve, the fight does have quite a fun rhythm to it, and I can honestly say it's one of my favorite fights in the game. The act of dodging itself is fun. Well, it would be, were it not for the one single thing that turns an otherwise well-designed boss into a miserable experience. The shadow hands. And not the burst of shadow hands that he does in retaliation to going above him. On expert mode and above, Deerclops will periodically spawn shadow hands that fly at the player, becoming more common as it gets lower in health. These shadow hands are the single worst attack in the entire game. They read your movement and try to go in front of where you're going in order to cut you off and hit you. There is exactly one other boss in the entire game that predicts your movements and shoots projectiles in front of where you're going, and that is the Moonlord. Let's compare the two. Deerclops summon shadow hands at variable timing intervals based on their HP that have no relation to the timings of the rest of their attacks. The Moonlord's projectiles come from a predictable location and follow a predictable straight line. Deerclops' projectile spawn locations are random, as is their path and speed. This is how much time you have to react to Deerclops if you have bad RNG. This is how much time you have to react to the Moonlord, and this is only going to change based on your positioning. The Moonlord's projectiles are this big. Deerclops' projectiles are this big. And tiny difference, the Moonlord is the last boss in the game, and the player has access to incredibly powerful mobility options by then. Deerclops is pre-hard mode, and potentially the first boss for ambitious players. I've certainly fought him as the first boss in several playthroughs. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they're unavoidable or even that they make Deerclops extremely difficult. This isn't a matter of the boss being impossible or overly difficult. The problem with these shadow hands is that they undermine the boss by ruining the single thing the boss is designed around. Every other mechanic of Deerclops encourages the player to stay close, to make small and controlled movements, and to follow his rhythm to dodge his ice attacks. It's a Don't Starve inspired boss. It's meant to be kited around. And then the shadow hands come along, specifically cutting off the safe windows in the attacks, and ruin that. If you try to run between their legs and alternate with the rhythm, they will hit you, knock you back, and you will mess up. At any point in time, they can just spawn in front of you, dealing damage and knocking you back. You have to divert your direction, except you can't because going in the other direction is where the ice attack is. This leaves the player with 3 options. They can tank the damage and knock back when it happens. They can use a different strategy, typically some cheesy stuff with platforms or furniture that manipulates how his projectiles spawn, or they can repeatedly die and kill Deerclops through attrition. If the player wants to grind for gladiator armor, or if they're post-Skeletron, then the knockback can be ignored and the hands are less problematic, but that requires either an annoying amount of grinding or being past the point where Deerclops' drops are useful. Notably, every single one of those options is less fun and rewarding than dodging it how it was designed to be dodged. The shadow hands take a good fight and make it frustrating, and Deerclops could be so much better, and that is why I consider it to be the worst boss in the game. It's not a bad boss being made worse by a bad attack, it's a good boss being ruined by one. Being more difficult does not make the fight better. Also, as a related issue with the boss, Deerclops inflicting a practically unavoidable slow debuff for like 30 seconds is just awful. Being slowed is not fun, especially not for that long, especially in a boss fight heavily reliant on horizontal mobility, and especially for no reason. It would make more sense if Deerclops only used it if the player was trying to run away or something, but as is, you pretty much always begin the fight with 30 seconds of being slowed and can't effectively dodge. I would have him not use the attack until being down to like 95% HP to prevent him from opening every single fight with it. And that's Deerclops in 1.4.4.9. It's a pre-hard mode boss with a huge HP pool, fairly high damage, not particularly great loot, and it's annoying to fight. There's a reason so many people skip it. It just isn't appealing. The boss is really easy to summon, but it's such a slog to fight because of how annoying some of its mechanics are. If Deerclops was more enjoyable to fight, more people would fight it. It could be an actually fun boss to fight first, being more difficult but allowing a skilled player to handle it without getting hit, and giving you a strong but not completely overpowered reward. So how could Deerclops be improved? I don't think fixing Deerclops is that hard. At its core, there's a good rhythm and dodging pattern. The two mechanics I mentioned before are the problems. I already touched on the slow debuff, that just leaves the worst of the two mechanics. The Shadow Hands are one of the few things about Deerclops that isn't paralleled in Don't Starve. The Shadow Hands in that game spawn at night and try to extinguish your campfires, which leave you vulnerable to the dark. There are nightmare creatures which attack you at low sanity and often will show up during the Deerclops fight because it greatly decreases your sanity, but they don't work anything like the Shadow Hands in Terraria. If you wanted something like the Shadow Hands in Don't Starve, Deerclops could have a darkness mechanic. Imagine if they functioned similarly to the Lunatic Cultist's Prophecy's End attack, where Deerclops would summon a stationary Shadow Hand and, if it were left alive for long enough, it would inflict a debuff like Darkness or even Blackout. That would be very similar to Don't Starve's behavior, and it wouldn't mess up the existing boss's rhythm. The player would have to manage when to kill the hands and when to fight the boss, and skilled players could do the dodging motions while barely able to see. For the worthy Deerclops could do it permanently, and it'd make a lot more sense than Golem doing it. Alternatively, if you wanted something like the Nightmares in Don't Starve, you could keep the same idea of him summoning shadowy attacks but rework how they function. If they only spawned a certain distance away from Deerclops, you would prevent the issue of the player running into them and getting knocked back when trying to go through his legs. They could also spawn in a way that increases pressure on the player but follows the boss's rhythm rather than being semi-random. Deerclops might telegraph one side of them during the third hit of their combo as unsafe and attack it with a Shadow Hand, forcing the player to choose the correct side. Or, a whole new attack could be added. Instead of the 1-2-3 ice attack combo, there could be a purely Shadow Hand attack that happens sometimes. Maybe there's a ring of Shadow Hands that encircles Deerclops, forcing the player to get close instead of distant. Deerclops could send in a hand from a consistent location that homes similarly to Skeletron's skulls or the Moonlord's eye projectiles, forcing the player to get out of their turning radius. If the randomness of them was reduced, they wouldn't be as bad. Personally, what I think would be the best change is to get rid of the Shadow Hand attack entirely and give Deerclops a death ray similar to the Moonlord. And I know how that sounds, but hear me out here. In Don't Starve, during the Winter's Feast seasonal event, Deerclops is reskinned and gets a laser beam attack. It'll occasionally use that instead of the normal attacks, and it forces the player to dodge and react differently than normal. That is both something that comes directly from Don't Starve Together and already exists in Terraria. Maybe it sweeps both sides and the player has to jump to dodge it. It could be like the Moonlord's Death Ray, where it aims itself based on the player's location and sweeps over them. Most importantly, it would fit into Deerclops' existing rhythm and design. It wouldn't punish the player with randomness and undermine the fight. I sincerely hope that Deerclops gets some kind of rework or the Shadow Hands are redesigned. If I were to change anything about Terraria, that would be it, because I do like the boss otherwise. The Shadow Hands are an expert mode change, and it feels like the boss was fully designed around the idea of forcing the player nearby, and then Relogic realized that they needed an expert buff, so they implemented the hands. Consider that, in 1.4.4, they nerfed every teleporting enemy in the game to make them less able to spawn on top of or directly in front of where the player is moving. Deerclops' Shadow Hand behavior is quite similar to those, and it's still in the game. It basically is just a teleporting hitbox that always tries to go in front of you. Typically, expert mode changes revamp boss fights to make them more engaging and interesting. Deerclops is the only boss in the game who gets considerably worse on expert, and that is a massive shame.